Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that your government has decided what you can wear, where you can go, what you can study, what job you can do, and even what you are allowed to say. Now imagine that there is almost no way to challenge those decisions. This isn't the plot of a dystopian movie. This is Afghanistan. Since the Taliban returned to power in August 2021, Afghanistan has undergone one of the most dramatic political and social transformations in the modern world. And behind the headlines about religion, security, and a new Afghanistan lies a much darker question. What actually happened to the people living under Taliban rule? Let's find out. On September 25, 2021, reports emerged from Herat of a suspected criminal's body being publicly displayed from a crane, accompanied by a warning. It sent a brutal message. The Taliban were back, and their justice system would be completely different. Today, Afghanistan's judicial system operates under the Taliban's interpretation of Islamic law. There is no functioning constitutional system comparable to the one that existed under the previous government. Instead, Taliban-appointed judges and religious authorities enforce their interpretation of Sharia. And this is where things become extremely controversial. The Taliban have revived punishments that include public executions, corporal punishment, and in some cases, amputations. But the situation becomes even more severe when we talk about women. Under Taliban rule, women and girls have faced sweeping restrictions on education, employment, movement, and public life. And this wasn't always the reality in Afghanistan. Before the Taliban takeover, Afghan women were working as doctors, journalists, judges, politicians, teachers, and members of the security forces. But after the Taliban returned, many of those opportunities disappeared, and perhaps the biggest battlefield became something that doesn't look like a battlefield at all. Education. When the Taliban first returned to power, schools across Afghanistan were disrupted. Boys were eventually allowed to return to secondary education, but girls above 6th grade were effectively shut out of secondary school, and the restrictions didn't stop there. Women were later banned from universities as well. The result? An entire generation of Afghan girls has been forced to watch their education and future disappear. Think about that for a second. A girl who was preparing to become a doctor, a teacher, an engineer, or simply someone who wanted to build her own life, can suddenly be told, you can't go to school anymore. And that's not just an education crisis, it's an economic crisis. Because when half of a country's population is prevented from fully participating in education and employment, the consequences eventually reach the entire economy. Afghanistan was already suffering from poverty, unemployment, food insecurity, and a collapsing healthcare system. Then came another major problem: the international isolation of the Taliban government. Most countries have refused to formally recognize the Taliban government. International aid, which Afghanistan had heavily depended upon for years, was disrupted. Businesses struggled, families lost sources of income, and ordinary Afghans were caught in the middle. The healthcare system has also faced enormous pressure. Hospitals have struggled with shortages of money, equipment, medicine, and trained medical professionals. For a country already suffering from extreme poverty, this creates a devastating cycle. No money means fewer hospitals. Fewer hospitals mean fewer doctors and resources. And fewer resources mean ordinary people suffer the most. But Afghanistan's economic crisis has another complicated dimension: opium. For years, Afghanistan was one of the world's largest producers of opium. The Taliban had also historically benefited from taxation and revenue connected to the drug economy. But after returning to power, the Taliban announced a ban on opium cultivation. On paper, that sounds like a positive move. But there is a problem. For many rural farmers, poppy cultivation was one of the few ways to earn enough money to survive. So banning it without creating equally profitable alternatives can create another economic shock. And this tells us something important about Afghanistan. The Taliban inherited a country that was already economically fragile. But their policies have created new problems while attempting to solve others. Now comes the question people often ask. Why is the Taliban's interpretation of Sharia so different from the systems followed in other Muslim-majority countries? The answer is complicated. Sharia isn't a single law book with one universally agreed interpretation. Different Islamic scholars and schools of jurisprudence have developed different interpretations over centuries. The Taliban primarily follow the Hanafi tradition, combined with their own extremely conservative interpretation of Islamic law and Pashtun social traditions. And under the Taliban, this interpretation has been used to justify extremely strict rules governing public life. But there is another factor we cannot ignore: power. The Taliban isn't simply a religious movement anymore. It is the ruling authority of an entire country. And when political power, military power, and religious authority become concentrated in the same hands, there are very few mechanisms left for ordinary citizens to challenge the government. This is why Afghanistan's future is so uncertain. But there is another uncomfortable part of this story: the role of the United States and the wider international community. Afghanistan's modern history cannot be understood without looking at decades of foreign intervention. During the Cold War, the United States supported Afghan resistance fighters fighting the Soviet occupation. Over the following decades, militant groups evolved, alliances changed, and Afghanistan became a breeding ground for extremist movements. Then came September 11, 2001. The United States invaded Afghanistan. For almost 20 years, American and Allied forces remained there. Billions of dollars were spent. A new Afghan government was built. An army was trained. Schools were constructed. Women entered public life. But in August 2021, everything collapsed with astonishing speed. The Taliban entered Kabul. The Afghan government fell. And the United States left. 20 years of war ended with the very group America had fought returning to power. And that raises one of the biggest questions of all. After 20 years and trillions of dollars spent, what was actually achieved? For ordinary Afghans, that question isn't academic. It is their life. A woman who lost her job. A girl who lost her school. A family struggling to afford food. A doctor working inside an overwhelmed hospital. A young person who has no idea what their future looks like. These are the real consequences of political decisions. And perhaps the darkest irony is this: Afghanistan has experienced decades of foreign intervention. Civil war, extremism, poverty, and political instability. Yet ordinary Afghans continue to pay the price. So is Afghanistan heading toward a better future? Or is it moving backwards? The answer isn't simple. The Taliban claims it has brought security and stability after decades of war. But security without freedom raises another question. What kind of peace is it? Because a country isn't truly progressing simply because the fighting stops. Progress also means education, opportunity, healthcare, economic stability, human rights, and most importantly, the freedom for ordinary people to imagine a better future. Afghanistan's story is far from over, and what happens next could determine the future of an entire generation. So now I want to know what you think. The Taliban can actually rebuild Afghanistan. Or is the country moving further away from the modern world? Tell me your opinion in the comments. If you found this video informative, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to know what's really happening in Afghanistan. And if you enjoy stories about dark realities, hidden history, mysteries, and the world that most people never see, subscribe to S-Codex, because here, we don't just tell you what happened, we uncover why it happened. Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and keep uncovering.